Welcome to the Online Bodyguard podcast with host Philip Rindell, CEO and founder of Defuse, a global threat and intelligence consultancy that blends psychology and intelligence to mitigate threats and risks to prominent people and brands.
Welcome everyone to the first episode of the Online Bodyguard podcast, and I'm delighted that on this particular episode, our first one, my very special guest is my friend and business partner, Dr. Lorraine Sheridan. Hi, Lorraine.
Hello, Phil.
So here we are then, our very first podcast, and who better to have than you, not just because you're a partner in the business of Defuse, but because you are hugely qualified with massive experience to go with it. So just for those that don't know you, can you kind of just give us a quick resume of who you are and what your expertise is?
I am Lorraine. I have spent the last 25 years researching stalking. Apparently, I am a leading global expert in stalking, harassment, threat assessment, and similar things. I was until recently president of the Asia Pacific Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. I've been a profiler for the UK police and other police forces. I've been an academic, and I've produced loads and loads and loads of research and various books on things like stalking, suicide in prisons, all different forms of violence, sexual offending. And I have run courses in forensic psychology, undergraduate and postgraduate. So I am all things forensic psychology. Oh, and I'm a chartered forensic psychologist as well. Wow. That'll do for now. Wow. That'll do.
So I guess the question that comes to mind is, what first kind of interested you about stalking?
Long ago, I was working for the National Health Service in England. I left school at 16 and I didn't really have any qualifications at all. So I got an entry-level job and I was made redundant when I was about 22, 23. And I thought, what am I going to do with my life? You know, I've always had these kind of really basic jobs and I always wanted to go to university. So I chanced it and I did it. And then in my very, very final year, I realised I was doing quite well. And I saw this thing called stalking on the telly. You're talking 1997, which is when the United Kingdom had its very, very first anti-stalking law. So stalking was big on the telly. And because I was in the last year of my degree, I looked up, in the libraries and things, stalking, what is it? I'm really intrigued by it. I want to know all about it. There was nothing there. So I thought, right, I'm going to do something about this. Nobody knows anything about this in Europe. A little bit in the US, nothing in Europe. This is my thing. And then I decided to do a PhD on it. So I did my final year project for my degree and then a PhD. And as a kid from a council estate in Leicester, I never actually thought I'd do a PhD, but I did. And then I thought, one of these days I'll move on to something else. And I did branch out into other bits of forensic psychology, but I've always stuck with stalking. So 25 years now.
So when you did your PhD, what was the thesis about?
What I wanted to do was to really kind of map out the course and nature of stalking, because I noticed really early on that a big reason that other people hadn't researched it is because it's really tricky to define. Because ultimately, when you think about it, it's lots of kind of often everyday behaviours, and it's only when you group them together, like recognise a course of conduct, that you sometimes realise that you've got a problem. Yeah, some stalkers can be really dangerous, but they often begin in little dribs and drabs. Like that old analogy of the frog in the boiling water. You know, that if you kind of put a frog in boiling water, he'll jump out. But alternatively, if you heat him up slowly, degree by degree, he won't jump out. And stalking's like that. It has this difficult quality for people to pin down. And so what I wanted to do was really get an idea of what is it and what do people think it is and what are we going to do about it? So that was my PhD, laying all the groundwork for that. Incidentally, the frog thing isn't true. It's just an analogy, but that fact about frogs isn't actually true. So there you go. Education for you, Phil.
So, okay, so how do you define stalking then?
I go with Pathé and Mullen, Australian psychiatrists, they come out with what I think is the best definition about 20 years ago. And they talk about it being a constellation of behaviors. So a whole different range of behaviors, like all the stars in the sky, loads of different behaviors, endless ones, where one person targets another one and basically upsets them.
So, okay, so what's the difference then between stalking and harassment?
Well, that's a really tricky one because people often use the terms interchangeably, but technically, really, stalking is a form of harassment. Say you've got this kind of big umbrella behavior, harassment, and underneath it fall all different kinds of things. Sexual harassment, bullying can be a form of harassment, and stalking tends to be considered as a particularly severe, targeted, repetitive form of harassment. So when you got sexual harassment, that's normally got a really particular sexual focus, right? And when you've got bullying, people are normally picking on some particular attribute of the target or the victim. But when it's stalking, it's this persistent, never give up, all consuming, all embracing, extreme bother, for want of a better word.
So when then does harassment become stalking then?
That's the magic question, Phil. That's the magic question. Nobody really knows. People always say, look, but what is the line? Where is the line? Because if you think about it, say, for instance, say you and me are in a relationship, right? I know it's painful for you to imagine, but we'll imagine that. Sorry, Mrs. Phil. It's only hypothetical. And you finish with me. I mean, of course, I'd be really upset, wouldn't I? Right. And let's say that I phone you up 3 times on a Thursday and 3 times on a Friday, crying and wanting to know why. I don't think many people would consider that stalking. They'd say that's a bit harassing. She's phoned him 6 times in 2 days. He clearly don't want to know her. That's a bit harassing. And then if I continued that behavior for a month and hung around outside your house, accosting you and shouting at you and screaming at you and sending you letters and texting you, then clearly I am a stalker. But there's no definite line where one turns into the other. I always say it's a bit like great art. You don't really know how to define it, but you tend to know it when you see it.
Mm. So, I mean, from a policing background, we were, I think, pretty poor at investigating, or not so much investigating, but defining it. And of course, in the UK, the legislation certainly doesn't help that. But certainly one of the things we looked at was when, people have to start changing their behaviour because of the harassment they're having. That tends to that's when it kind of starts becoming stalking, when their behaviour has to change because of the harassment.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And that is one that I've actually used myself without knowing that you did the same kind of thing. But, when speaking to people, when I say, look, think about it. How are you reacting? Are you changing your everyday habits? Do you feel kind of an overall sense of fear of being hunted? And that can be quite difficult to define because they say, I don't know, I'm not really sure, I think so, or I'm trying not to feel afraid. But that one, your one, is beautiful because it's tangible, isn't it? So you can say to people, have you actually changed your behaviour? Are you looking over your shoulder? Have you changed your routines? Have you blocked unknown numbers from your phone? If you've changed your behaviour, I think that's a really, really good one. Definitely.
And so I was fortunate. I did some sort of really good courses on stalking and learnt a great deal about it. Mainly to be honest, towards the end of my career. But I sort of didn't realise initially that there were different types of stalkers. We often hear the term stalking in the media and in other environments where it's kind of grouped together as one thing. But that's not actually the case, is it? Because stalkers are all very different.
Exactly. And people have this idea as well in their heads. Even now, when, you and me kind of started working in this area a couple of decades ago, you said that, the police did a bad job. Everybody did a bad job everywhere in the world. There just wasn't a shared language. There wasn't a lot of information. But even now, when there is a shared language for most people and a lot of information, people still have the same problems, don't they? And oh God, what was the question? I forgot. I've gone off on one.
So in terms of
different types
of stalkers.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? People often assume stalkers are this homogenous group. Some people think that they're this shadowy, strange figure at the other end of an alleyway or a computer keyboard, or some think it's solely the province of ex-partners. But as we now know, they're a hugely heterogeneous group. So many differences. Different researchers and practitioners have come up with various different typologies. But generally speaking, we can say probably about a third, maybe up to a half of cases involve an ex-partner, right? The rest will be a mix of strangers, acquaintances, but it's even more than that. It's just not just your former relationship. Some people will be really quite seriously mentally ill. For example, I've worked on cases where the stalker actually believed that they were married to or had a relationship with somebody that they'd never met, or they may have had a relationship with them in another life and they absolutely believed that in our previous incarnation 500 years ago we were married, so I'm going to stalk you until you remember. Other people will stalk for entirely different motivations. Some people are really like the Hollywood movies. Thankfully they're rare, in that they'll stalk because they just like playing with people. It's quarry and prey. It is sadism in many, many ways. And it's really, really difficult sometimes to distinguish, particularly in the early stages of a stalking case, what the motivation actually is, because often they start very, very slowly. So we may be dealing with somebody who's quite socially incompetent, who wants a relationship with somebody, but they're pretty poor at try to build and demonstrate an intent in a relationship. But on the other hand, we may have somebody that's highly sadistic, incredibly cruel, and intends to completely ruin the life of somebody just because they can. So yeah, loads of different typologies, loads of different motivations. It's a really big group.
And then presumably they pose different risks to different people depending on their typology.
Absolutely. And it's really difficult for the non-specialists, and often even for the specialists, to find out which category a stalker may belong in. And also, we've got some beautiful categories made by different researchers. We've all come up with our own different typologies, none of which are perfect. But it could be really difficult to slot people into those categories as well, because, like with anything, categories are a guide. Yeah, so they give us a really, really good idea of what to expect, in this case, from particular types of stalkers and how we should manage or treat them. But people don't always fit neatly into categories, so we do need to always keep that in mind as well. The best category, in my opinion, and in most people's opinion, is the Mullen and Pathé one, their stalker typology. That is the chief, the boss.
Yeah. And so if we kind of focus a little bit more on the areas that we deal with Defuse, which is predominantly more to do with stalking around prominent people, public figures, even to the extent of figureheads in terms of business figureheads. So not necessarily domestic relationships.
No.
What's different about those type of stalkers?
What we tend to see with people that target people of higher status, as you say, your big brand figureheads, your public figures, your government representatives, we tend to see higher rates of mental disorder. People often look at kind of, your domestic stalkers and say, God, that person must be really, really crackpot. They must be so ill to, spend so many months and years and basically ruin their life pursuing somebody. However, most stalkers, domestic stalkers, are not diagnosably mentally disordered. They may have substance abuse issues or a few personality issues, but maybe not even those. But your people that go after your public figures, we see higher rates of mental disorder, sometimes quite extreme mental disorder. And although mental disorder and violence don't have a neat relationship, not anywhere in forensic psychology. In fact, people with mental disorder are more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators. Some people, nevertheless, who target public figures can be incredibly dangerous.
And so what, in terms of dangerous, if you are, do they ever just kind of give up and go away and think, oh, I'm bored of this now, I'm moving on?
Hardly ever. They hardly ever just give up. The thing is with stalkers, any stalkers, domestic, public figure, whatever, and it doesn't really matter about the motivation, what they have in common is they're persistent. And then you add in kind of standard human nature. If you put effort into something, you want something out of it, don't you? Say you put an effort into building up a business and you spent 6 years doing it, but it's still going nowhere. Most people still persist. We just do that, don't we? It's like, the next big client's around the corner. I'm going to have me breakthrough. It's going to happen. And stalkers are no exception to that, but they are unusually persistent. They just will not give up and they won't go away. And the longer they do it, the more they put into it, the more they want out of it, the less likely they are to disappear.
And so how do you understand or acknowledge or recognize when things are escalating, when things are getting worse, when they're going from, shall we say, stalking, cyber stalking, to potentially becoming violent?
Well, there's loads and loads of risk assessments out there. Risk assessment, violence risk assessment is a massive industry, multi-million dollar pound industry around the world. But a lot of people don't have access to those, do they? They don't have access to these kind of risk assessment forms and tests and tools and things. So I always say to people, trust your instincts. The human brain has been around for a long time. And think back to, the days when, we were all at risk of snakes and woolly mammoths. Mind you, some of us still are. I live in Australia, so I've still got all my senses up, and just think back to those times. Those bits of your brain may be a bit more sleepy than they used to be, hundreds of thousands of years ago, but they're still there. So I say to people, trust your instincts. Actually, as well, there's studies showing that when you're targeted, particularly by a persistent chronic criminal, such as a stalker or domestic violence offender, your instincts are really sharpened. And people just tend to know. They just tend to know, like, I can feel it, something's going to happen. We really need to trust that instinct. As I say, proper studies are showing that. However, Phil, in the whole world of public figures, they often don't know, do they? Because all these people, they may be seen to represent something by the fixated person, by the stalker. But the recipient of these ideas, these behaviors, these motivations, they often don't know because their security don't tell them, the PA doesn't tell them, they get their email screened. So they can't trust their instincts. They just don't know. That's why they need people like you.
So what sort of warning signs then? If you're the PA or you're the security, excuse me, what sort of warning signs are there? What are the red flags that we're looking for?
It's a tricky business because sometimes the people that are going to be the most dangerous look on the face of it to just be really benign, just really, really gentle little missives and messages where other people, I'm going to cut your head off and you're the worst person known to humanity and you'll be dead by Friday and blah, 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 blah. They're often just venting. But some red flags do exist. And we always take direct threats seriously. Yeah, particularly from your ex-partner stalkers. Research with thousands of cases has found over the years that if an ex-partner stalker makes a really explicit, specific threat, the chances are they're going to do exactly what they're threatening to do. But other red flags can be a reappearance after a seeming hiatus, Why have they suddenly come back? And really big deals are stressors in the life of the fixated person or the stalker. And any indicator that they've got to the point whereby they've got nothing left to lose. And if they're blaming the person that they're stalking or fixated on, that's the biggest red flag of all. I've got nothing left to lose. It's all your fault. Because it's difficult to kind of comprehend in some ways, but some of these folk, the more they stalk, the more cruel they are to their victims, the more they believe it's the actual victim's fault. Because they work it out in their heads and they're all like, well, you know, if this chief executive or my ex-girlfriend would just give in to me and give me what I wanted, everything would be fine. But they won't give in. They won't give me $1 million to go away. They won't come back and live with me and be my partner forevermore. So the stalker actually believes that they're the one that's being controlled. They're the one that's suffering. And they're the one that, you know, if the victim just gave in to them, they'd be fine. They'd be free. And these people become incredibly dangerous because they feel so victimized, even though they're actually the offender. They can sometimes get to the point where they think, right, the only way I can stop this is to completely take them out of the picture. And sometimes when these people do actually act out fatally, they've described this beautiful relief straight afterwards. It's a release. I did it. I got all the stress and strain away. They're no longer controlling me.
So, okay. So, I mean, I can remember sort of some of the training I had was things like if you're receiving emails and then you start getting phone calls and letters and what have you. So all of a sudden you get multiple forms of communication, for instance.
Yeah. I kind of went off the point a bit, didn't I? I went into talking to catathymic rage. Yes. So that is great. Yeah. Broadening out the methods. Exactly. That is a massive red flag. So yeah, as you say, I was only getting emails, now I'm getting phone calls. And any approach, if they've not been approaching right from the beginning, but they're approaching, there they suddenly are. You know, it was all emails and phone calls. It was all kind of, you know, nasty old answer machine rants, but now they've been seen.
Yeah.
That's a massive one. But any kind of broadening out. So we've got end of tether type stuff, you know, total blame on the person that they're bothering. And I can't say broadening to death, no idea why. Broadening out their behaviours, you know, using different methods of harassment and stalking, and also broadening out the targets as well. So, okay, I've been going for the chief executive officer and she's not really giving me a lot of joy. You know, she's not answering me, but I know where her mum lives. And her mum's pretty old, and her mum's got long COVID, and her mum's not doing very well because I read about that on Facebook. So, you know, I'm going to harass her mum. Ha, 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 ha. That will get a rise out of the big boss.
So when they start to move away from the kind of original target to other targets within the same cohort, if you like.
Within the same cohort. Yeah. And they'll do that for a number of reasons. Two chief reasons being, number one, to really upset, you know, the main target. You know, imagine if your old mum was getting bothered by your stalker, you're not going to feel very good about that, are you? You're not going to be very happy. And the other reason is to find out more information about the target, because stalkers and fixated people can be so very, 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 very clever. And this is the thing, Phil. People think that, you know, they're kind of weirdos and they're just odd and they'd be able to spot them. And I've interviewed for research and also kind of working with the victims and survivors of stalking, thousands of victims and survivors. And over the past 25 years, one of the themes that always comes up is, oh my gosh, Lorraine, I thought that I would absolutely be able to see a stalker coming. I absolutely believed that they would be weird in some way. They'd be odd. There'd be kind of like freaky people. There'd be these strange socially isolated weirdos. Nope, not at all. They can be Okay, I've seen stalkers, convicted stalkers that were doctors, that were lawyers, that were actually celebrities themselves. From the lowest to the highest and everybody in between. Anybody can be a stalker. And stalkers could be so clever and so resourceful.
So what's the advice then? If you think you're being stalked, what do you do?
What do you do? First of all, you keep records. Always, 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 always. Because if you don't keep records, it's going to be even more difficult to convince people, that are your friends and family, and people, professionals that can help you. It'll be harder to convince them that you're being targeted because it's so difficult to define stalking. It's so difficult to describe it. And for many people, we don't want to admit that we're being stalked. Say, it's just a bit of hassle. They'll go away eventually. Or, this is my kind of mum's neighbour's daughter's friend that's bothering me and I don't want to cause trouble. And, we can deny it to ourselves. So if we keep a record, though, we can say, gosh, actually, this is really, really serious. Because research I did with the Network for Surviving Stalking some years ago, a UK charity, we asked a lot of people in depth about their experiences of stalking. And we found that in the average case, more than 100 incidents had occurred before people turned around to themselves and said, yeah, I am actually being stalked, by which time the stalking is entrenched and the stalker's put a load in and wants to get a load out of it. So keeping records is hugely important, both to demonstrate to yourself what's going on, and then you've got a log. Because it's so difficult to define stalking, and agencies, professionals have such a hard time really trying to get their heads around what it is. So if you go with your log, boom. So always keep the evidence, keep everything you can. And even if it's really nasty, give it someone else to keep.
And do you, should you respond? If they're contacting you, should you respond to their contact or should you just blank them?
Such a tricky one because everybody's so different. I mean, in the old days when we first started to research stalking, the old days, but we are talking like 20 odd years ago, we always used to say, do not respond. Do not ever respond. Don't even think about responding. Just give a blank wall. But it's more subtle than that. So what we tend to advise these days, Phil, is under advice from an expert, if possible, we will work out whether there should be a response. So, for example, you see, in ex-partner cases, if you've got a highly controlling ex-partner, particularly when we've seen domestic violence then evolve into stalking after the relationship ended, and that person is really used to keeping tabs on the person being targeted, and then all of a sudden no response, this can be really catastrophic to the offender. They can then be like, no, I absolutely have to know what she is doing, and I'm going to just barge in there, and it's going to get very violent and nasty. Catastrophic reaction. So in some cases, particularly domestic cases, we can advise these days under expert advice some little channels of response, particularly in cases as well where, people have shared a relationship and they've got kids together and stuff. Sometimes you have to respond. You haven't got a choice, have you? But for corporate cases, for example, public figure cases, we usually advise, but not always, do not respond unless you have to. But then the world works against you, doesn't it? Because if you've got things like complaints processes and your policy says, we respond to all complaints in 14 days, you have to respond. And it's very, very difficult. Actually, I think it's impossible to offer general advice on how to respond because they're so different, and every stalker wants something different. But what we can say generally is don't give away any information, don't make any promises, don't be overly kind, don't be mean, be logical. My friend, Dr. Annabelle Chan in Melbourne, is very, very wise, and she came up with something very clever, what she calls the persona of the kind robot. Yeah. So you as a robot, you've been programmed to be kind, but you have no feelings, you have no cares, you'd have no emotions, you do not get involved. You are kind robot. Because the problem with these people, some of them, is you give them the tiniest little bit of space and the door crashes open. That's it. And this is the thing with stalkers. So, if they send you an email, right, if they send 85 emails and you break and you respond on the 85th email, what's the message you're giving? Dear stalker, you have to email me 85 times to get me to answer. So kind robot, Phil.
Yeah.
That's the general advice. But some stalkers are also very vexatious, very querulous. The kind of people, we've all heard about them in the old days, the 1980s, they used to write all the letters in the local newspapers, didn't they? I remember seeing them all in the Leicester Mercury, same names, week after week, carrying on about fences and councils and bees and whatnot. And then, some of these people tended to graduate and still do, and they clog up the courts. They're the people that 1% of the people taking up 99% of the court time, endless, querulous complaints and on and on and on. And you give them an inch and they take a mile and they turn everything. Like conspiracy theories, they're kind of related to them in some ways. Every little tiny thing is pulled apart, taken apart and packaged back to you with bells on. So you can't give information. Never any promises, never any assurances, never any information.
So let's move on then, because one of the services that we provide, specifically for the reasons that you just talked about, is the profiling.
Yeah.
So tell me, what is profiling?
Profiling is when you get Lorraine and you show her a letter that somebody's wrote you, and she tells you how old the person is, what they're wearing, and what football team they support. But that's how it is on the telly a lot of the time.
That was my next question. What isn't it? But actually, you just answered that one. But
yeah, exactly.
So what is it? What is profiling?
But that's what you kind of tend to believe on the telly. And to this day, I often get young students. When I used to work at universities, I'd often get young students coming up like, I want to do profiling, and I'd say, okay, how good are you at statistics? Oh, I'm not going to do statistics. I'm just going to do profiling. How are you going to do that? I'm going to read about lots of different crimes, and then I'll know what's what. So sadly, profiling is nothing like that exciting. What it is these days anyway, it's based on evidence. So, all scientific fields of inquiry publish studies, don't they? That's how science moves on. You test hypotheses, you test ideas, you find out about stuff, you write it, you send it to academic journals. And, people then review it and say if it's any good. And if you're lucky, you might eventually get all this stuff published. And so luckily, all around the world for a number of years, people have been publishing lots of stuff in forensic psychology. So we know quite a lot about all different samples around the world of sometimes really, really niche particular offenders. And all as forensic psychology people, we share the unpublished stuff as well. So profiling is knowing an awful lot of research and also knowing where the gaps in the research are and knowing how to put it all together to find the type of people that just may be more likely than some other types of people to have done a certain thing. But there's not a big book you can look in. You have to read literally thousands and thousands and thousands of academic papers that are scattered to the four winds and the bottom of the ocean and the seven seas and whatever. And you have to know stats. So you have to be really quite decent at knowing how powerful all these statistical connections are. And then you need to know your psychology as well. So you need to know all about kind of different theories of personality, and you need to know how they all work together, and various mental disorders and how humans react in certain situations. And so when you put all that together, you tend, after many, many years of kind of study and continued, self-directed learning, you may have a decent idea of who is more likely than somebody else to do a particular bad thing.
Because you and I have worked on a case recently, which obviously we're not going to disclose, but the feedback from the profile that you produced, when they've continued their behaviour was almost, the client was saying it was almost like it was a horoscope in terms of it was bang on. This is exact, what was predicted was exactly how they're behaving. But that's based on huge expertise and huge, years and years of research and knowledge, and that's not a course you go on. You do this, and the reason that obviously we do this product and service, and the reason why you do it for us, as part of the business, is because it's literally decades of expertise that allows you to look at all that literature around someone, or the correspondence, or the information around their social media, everything else that they might have. And from that, you can then give an outline of how that person may behave and what threats they may pose.
I didn't know the client said that. You see, you never tell me nice things. You tell him the whole global population.
I told you it beforehand.
I don't remember anything about that. No, that's lovely. Yeah, it's exactly right. No, you are exactly right. So, I think I was probably like, a lot of the students that I still meet these days. I always thought that, I'll go on a course, maybe like a master's course, or do a PhD or something, and then I'll know all this stuff. I knew 0.0001 of it. So, yeah, it's just been years. Actually, I keep saying 25 years. It's 26. It's 2022 already, isn't it? 26 years of spending at least 25, 30, often a lot more hours a week, reading this stuff, researching in the area myself, creating the actual studies myself and getting them published in scientific journals, and interviewing people and talking to both offenders, victims, and also witnesses for 25 years. And then that allows me to build up a mental map of the kind of routes that people take.
So when would you advise people to have a profile done?
When they've got somebody that just won't go away, and people do try a few things. In a perfect world, people would come to you straight away and will say, no, don't respond like that, because that will make the person come back and make them really angry and da 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 da. But that's not what human nature is. So if you've got somebody that just won't go away, or you just don't know who they are. So although I can't tell you probably, the home address and what football team they support, what I might be able to do is say whether this person is actually somebody you know, because often stalkers tend to be strangers, and they are very, very not strangers. Or I may be able to tell you what they really, really want, and whether you met them before or not, and what they may be doing next, and what we should or shouldn't be doing to impact what they're going to do next. You see, what it's all about in the modern age, the whole approach to risk assessment, violence, and threat assessment these days, it's all about scenario planning. Like the kind of stuff when you think about all the generals years ago with a great big map, working out, if we send a few troops down there and we plant a bomb down there, then this and that might happen. It's like that, scenario planning. So we think about what the worst case scenario might be. This person's going to rock up, with a gun at the headquarters in New York. Oh, that's going to be bad. And then we can work back from there. What can we do that would actually, aid that happening? So therefore we ain't going to do it. And what could we do to stop that happening? And we can do it for really big scenarios, like somebody, we think if this person continues this route, they may plant a large bomb, or, one-to-one scenarios as well. This person, they've had an acrimonious breakup. If the person who then became a stalker sees his ex with a new boyfriend, he's going to act out violently. What are we going to do to stop us getting there? It's all about scenario planning. So if people think of a scenario in their head and they just think, I don't like this feels awkward, I don't like this person, I don't like what they're doing, and I've got it in my mind that this is going to get worse, that's another reason why you should then seek a profile if possible.
Fabulous. So, okay, Lorraine, we're coming to the end of our inaugural podcast. Any other words of wisdom you want to share on stalking and profiling on what we do?
Oh God, let me think a minute. Hang about, governor. Don't know. Can't think about. Okay. Because I've rattled on so long. I don't know what I'm on about.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is there anything you want me to say?
No, it's absolutely brilliant. It's been brilliant. So before we end, then I was going to sort of tell people what's coming next, because our next podcast in February is going to be with Richard Levick, who is the chairman and CEO of Levick, a crisis communication and public affairs firm. Hugely influential. They've been involved in the Venezuelan crisis, Qatar, the Gulf War, Guantanamo Bay, Catholic Church, and many others. Richard has been on a huge amount of times, but he's one of the 100 most influential people in the boardroom. So catch us for that one, because that's going to be really interesting. I've spoken to Richard a few times, and what he doesn't know about how to manage crisis is probably not worth knowing. So we'll look forward to that in February. Lorraine, thank you so much, as always. Your own inimitable style, which is why we love you. So thank you for that, and we'll see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Online Bodyguard podcast with host Philip Grindell, CEO and founder of Defuse. Please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platforms.